Just waiting a couple of minutes. I am very aware that there are still people joining in, but whilst we're waiting, just check that everybody's okay. Everybody here all right? Yeah, getting on well? That's good to know. We don't know what to do with this weather, sure we don't. Seems a bit warmer, feeling a bit more like spring. Yeah, although it's cold today, a bit chilly. Eamon saying that's right, it's a bit all over the place just right now. Absolutely, yeah. But there you go. That's the time of year. We've got 10 people, so I think we'll just wait a little bit longer. I know there are more people going to be joining and watching. And as I speak, it's going up. Yeah, even saying I can see that too, absolutely. The numbers are rising. Everybody looking forward to this tonight? It's great to have the chance to chat through some of these things, isn't it? Eamon's saying, well, you see, the thing is, we have to wait for people joining in from all over the world. That's the way it's going to be, isn't it? Do you know, I'm going to have to sell my autograph in the future, Eamon's saying. Adam's saying, you don't sign anything anymore, you take a selfie. Eamon, come on. Take a selfie, but do it. We'll all do it together, maybe. And Paul is saying, with this live streaming, it's incredible, you know, the reach you can have. It's brilliant. You know, it's fantastic to think how many people can actually join in tonight. It's a great development. Absolutely. We're at 24 viewers now, so it is just rising all the time. I think we'll keep going for another minute and see how many join in. Paula said, I think everybody's looking forward to some of the stories that we're going to be telling tonight. And it's just brilliant to look back over past times and think what it was been like in the past. Adam's saying, I'm sure you've had the chance to go back over the DVD Science for Times. Did you enjoy that again, watching it all again? I mean, it was made when? 2008? 13 years ago? I can't believe that's 13 years. Time has just flown in, hasn't it? Over to Magella. Magella's saying we've got 30 people watching, so I think we'll make a start. So my name is Magella, and I have worked for the BDA for 24 years now. And I am delighted to have everyone involved in this event tonight. You're really welcome. And I wanted to give you a little bit of the story around why we've set this event up, because I think that's really important and relevant. We have this DVD here, Signs of Our Times. And I'm sure many of you remember when that was first made, way back in 2008. It's a long time ago now. It was a piece of work that was funded for us by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And when we made the DVD, we had 30 individuals contribute to it from a whole range of backgrounds. Some were BSL, some were ISL, telling their stories of times past in the deaf clubs, in school, in sports, and in relationships and technology. It's a really valuable resource for the deaf community. And when we look at it now, I'm sure we all remember, sadly, or with very fond memories, those who are no longer with us in this DVD. And that's why it is such a precious resource to have that we want to pass down to future generations. Tonight is our first of our series of live streams. We're going to cover 3 topics tonight, another 3 the week after, and then the week after that, we'll move on a little bit. But we are very grateful for the opportunity to have tonight because it has happened due to funding from the Department for Communities. Nowadays, most of us don't really have a DVD player sitting available to us anymore. Most of us are going online, and we have our smart TVs, but we don't have a DVD player. And so the funding from the Department for Communities has enabled us to put this online, which means that everyone can just go in and hit the link and get to see that. And that's so important for future generations to have that available for them. When this event is over tonight, you will be able to go and see the Signs of Times link, and we'll let you know where that is. It's actually on the BDA website, and we'll show you a link later on. And we are aiming towards getting it put on YouTube, because once we get it on YouTube, we'll be able to share that link out, and it means that a wider audience will be able to access it. So, Adam, thank you very much for agreeing to host our event tonight. Thank you for everything that you've done in helping us prepare for it, and over to you for now. Thanks very much, Magellan, for the introduction. And I'd really like to thank our three contributors this evening who've come along to have a chat through some of the topics that we have watched on the DVD. And I'm really excited to get into all this. So can I ask each of you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourselves before we get into the topics. So let's start off with you, Elizabeth. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm Elizabeth McCautry, or Elizabeth McConnell. My name is Elizabeth McConnell. Eamon. My name is Eamon McCaffrey. And my name sign is relevant to my sporting activities because I've been in sport for many, many years now. And I'm really interested in a comparison between the way it was in the past and the way sports is now. Okay, we look forward to that, Eamon. And Paula, over to you. My name is Paula Clark, and I went to a deaf school where my name sign was based on my initials, PC. And then I had curly hair for a while. My name sign changed then, and my hair's changed, but I've kept the same name sign. Am I right thinking you perhaps all went to the same school growing up, but you were different stages in school, but all in the same school? I think I'm right. Elizabeth, what school did you go to? No, I went to the old school in the Lisburn Road from the age of 6 until I was 16. I stayed in that one school, the one in the Lisburn Road. You're always in the one school? Oh yes, I was, from 6 until I was 16. Eamon, were you always in Jordanstown School, or did you start off in Lisburn Road? Yeah. I started in Jordanstown School, 1965, at the age of 3. My mum put me into boarding there, and I stayed from the age of 3 until I was 16 as a boarder. So you started Jordanstown School when it was, no, yeah, I was in the old building. When I say I was in the old school, I was in the old Jordanstown School building, not Lisburn Road School, the Jordanstown, but the old building. There's a new building in the same site. What about you, Paula? Yes, I did. I was a boarder from the age of 8 until my 17th birthday, and I left school on the day of my 17th birthday. Just to introduce myself, I am Adam McCormick, and I'm delighted to be part of this discussion tonight, covering those 3 topics. The first one will be looking at technology. When I was looking at the DVD, Signs of the Times, and thinking about technology, it really struck me how much technology has come on. Because it talked there about parents who had babies, who in those days didn't have baby monitors, and they had to have the cot right beside the bed so it'd feel it shaking. Or people talking about doorbells where they didn't have pagers, so they had all sorts of things, people waving at the windows. And that really struck me in terms of technology and how it's changed. Have you any other thoughts on any of that? Eamon? Yeah, it's so different now from what it was in those days. To be honest, it was a lot harder work. We had to be really vigilant. had to watch out all the time for what was going on. Nowadays, I can wander around my kitchen. I know that I'll get alerted. In those, I can remember that if I thought there was somebody going to come out to the house, I had to be watching the door all the time. And nowadays, I don't need to worry about it because I know the doorbell will flash. But we had to really think hard and watch hard and be careful and always be on the go thinking about somebody being outside or what's happening. And who knows what it'll be like in 10 years' time. Maybe we'll look back then in 10 years and say, gosh, life was hard 10 years ago. I don't know. When I was 8, I went to Jordanstown School thanks to a social worker for the deaf. And a social worker came out to the house and told my parents they'd install a flashing doorbell. And then when people came and they hit the bell, my neighbours decided that was the funniest thing in the world and that they would start to play with that. And they used to come all the time and press the doorbell and make our lights flash. And it became a thing in our house. My family got fed up with it. So when we moved to pagers, actually, that was so much better. I felt much more independent. The problem with the pager is when you're in the bath or in the shower, you don't have your pager on, and then you're not being alerted to what's going on outside. So, you know, there's no perfect solution, is there? Elizabeth, what about you? Well, back in my time, I can remember that when I first got married, we had a flashing light installed, and I've always loved that. I love having a flashing doorbell. I'm really happy with that. I just find it very straightforward. But then when the children were born, when the children saw that, then that, you know, children in the area would come make fun of us and they would flash the doorbell as well. To be honest, that still happens a bit. People think that's a funny thing to do. You're all talking about your flashing doorbells. Do you have any other alert devices in the house? What about pagers, mobile phones, smoke detectors? Do you have any of those? Well, Eamon's saying nowadays, you know, the phone is a different thing. And so the light used to flash because we needed to know when the phone was ringing. That was important. But nowadays, we've got our mobile phones and the landline is there, but it's never used. And so it's very different, but the light used to flash to let us know that it was going on. But I think the flashing light is used much less nowadays because we're using our mobiles to text each other and let each other know. I can remember in the summertime when you would switch over, you had to switch over your light to day or night, and we would forget. And then people would come to the door and then it wouldn't have been switched on again. And then they would go away again. So I can remember that happening. So mobile phones have really helped, haven't they? Elizabeth is saying, when I can remember when my babies were born, we would have this wee thing in the cot, and then when they bed, then the light would flash. And I can remember that in my hall, luckily enough, we had glass panels put in, and it meant that when the cot made some noise and this little light flashed, I could see, and that was really useful. And then when the children got older and they started to crawl, then they used to touch the little microphone that was beside the cot, and then they would hold on to that, and then I had to move it. And I had to move it over beside the door handle to keep it away from them. Oh, I can remember those days. Okay, you said that there was a glass panel and you could see through it, but did that mean that you had to sort of watch all the time to see whether your child was crying? Well, I didn't really. Really, I kind of felt it was fairly clear. I was fairly relaxed about it. I could see through this glass panel on the door. I could see the light flashing, so I always was fairly confident. And if it, you know, if it flashed, it meant they were crying for a reason. Maybe their nappy needed change or something. It didn't feel like a big hassle. I can remember one other time when I think it was the light flashed because the doorbell went. And there was something else. So there was the baby and the light flashed, and then the doorbell and the light flashed. I can't think of anything else. Paula's saying it's really interesting talking about the doorbells and the lights flashing. I mean, with the pager, you forget, but I'd forgotten about that. With the doorbell, you had to switch from day or night or whatever. But I remember people coming to my door and waving through the window, and then going around the back of the house and into the garden and waving through the window. And I always remember our neighbours used to come and say to us, "Who are those strange people waving in through your windows?" Because they thought maybe they were robbers or something. But, you know, my deaf friends were quite happy to climb over fences to get around the back of my house and just come in and wave at the window. And the neighbours thought this was the strangest thing. Eamon's saying, yeah, I had to use that as an alarm in the morning, the flashing light to get me up in the morning. But we had the same, we had another flashing light for the baby crying. I can remember one time I was lying in bed and I got up 2 or 3 in the morning, panicked, thought I was late for work, grappling around in the dark and realized it wasn't. It was the baby alarm flashing. And then after that, I kind of had to sort out which was flashing. Was it my alarm to get me up in the morning, or was it the baby alarm? I had to sort out which they were because that was an awful shock. Jumping up. Adam's saying, so you had to be careful then the way you walked around the house because you could set the alarm off, couldn't you, in the morning? Yes, because if you clumped around the house, the baby alarm would flash. Elizabeth saying, yes, we had another small one, and sometimes it would go off if you weren't careful when you were going to bed. The alarm could get set off because the microphone was quite sensitive. Paul is saying, I stayed at a friend's house once and they were a family where, they were deaf as well. And they hadn't told me that they had this system. And I had my wee travel alarm with me, which you put under your pillow and then vibrates. But they hadn't told me they had another one. And they had one that they had put under my pillow. They didn't tell me about it, but it was much stronger than the one I was used to. And it started to vibrate to wake me up and it shook the whole mattress. And I thought I was in an earthquake and I was panicking. But I honestly, I thought I was having a heart attack. Didn't know what was going on. But you remember that was in the time of the Troubles. And so you didn't like those shocks in those days. It was a very vivid memory, that one. Eamon. Yeah, I can remember as well that we used to have lots of times when the power used to go off. Do you remember those days when the power would go off and it was a panic? It just doesn't really happen anymore. When power goes off, obviously as deaf people, it had a much bigger impact on us because the doorbell wouldn't work and the alarms wouldn't go off and all those kind of things. And you would get the letter through to say that there were going to be roadworks in your street and they would let you know, and that's usually daytime. But we used to have these times when the power would go off in the middle of the night and then you couldn't sleep all night long because you're worrying about waking up. So I think that was much harder on us as deaf people. So Adam said, when the power did go off and the lights didn't come on, I'm sure you were quite isolated as well, because how would you know if it was coming back on again? You'd have no communication system if there was no electric to let you know. Nowadays we've got the internet, but if the electric's off, then everything's off. How would you know? Actually, you're making me think I'm really glad we don't have them anymore, because I don't know what I would do without my electric supply. Elizabeth, you were about to say something. Oh, what was I going to say? Yes. Yes, in terms of the alarm, they could be very problematic and sometimes they would start going off all the time. And I can remember having to get people out to fix them and they would work really well. But sometimes, they could be a bit problematic and a bit sensitive. And then we couldn't hear, we didn't know what was going on. Paul is saying, I can remember a couple of years ago we had a really bad winter and there was a lot of snow. And in Belfast, all the power went off. And I had a lot of friends all in the same house who were all deaf, and we all panicked because we didn't know what to do, and it seemed to stay off for a long time. So we popped round to a neighbour and asked what was happening with the electric, and they were able to phone through and then let us know that someone was going to come in an hour's time. But we kept having to go in next door and ask for help. You're absolutely right, Adam. Our independence went very fast when the electric went off. Okay, Adam saying, so situations where the electric would go off with a doorbell, are you still using flashing doorbells? And if you go to visit someone who's a deaf friend, would you just go and ring the doorbell, or would you text them? Or would you stand at the front door and text to let them know you were there? I mean, I know for a lot of people, they just arrive at the door and they text. Oh yeah, that's what we would do. I would go to someone's door. You're absolutely right, Adam. I wouldn't press the doorbell anymore. I would text and let them know. So if I have a friend who's calling out at me, then at the house, she might arrange a time that if they're late, then they will text. That's absolutely right. But if in the past I used to always be worrying about it and think I couldn't go out and, I'd be afraid to go out and work in the garden. But now with the mobile phone, I can do what I want and not worry if they're late. So that's a really interesting point, because we text each other, then I can go out and work in the garden. I don't need to worry about missing that flashing light or missing the person at the door. Life is very different. As I said previously, we had to be so vigilant and constantly looking out for things maybe happening. Adam's saying, a last point in technology before we move on to the next topic. how did technology affect you in terms of communication? Do any of you still use a mini-com device, or have you all thrown them all out? Paula, you've thrown yours out. Elizabeth said, I don't use that anymore. Eamon? Elizabeth said, oh no, I don't. We do still have a fax machine, Elizabeth saying, because I have a friend who's quite elderly, and that's all they have. And they don't have a lot of other things. And so that's why I keep my fax machine, because I can write notes and I can put things down in that and then send it through to them. And it's just a useful way to keep communication going. And so sometimes if I'm going to visit them, then that's what I do. Most people don't have them now anymore. Most people have mobile phones, but I just know of one person still, the main mode of communication is still a fax machine for a couple of people. But it is dying out. Paula. One of the things that I've noticed is that when people were calling out to the house, we kind of expected that. Nowadays, people don't tend to visit each other as much. They have remote communications, they have FaceTime, WhatsApp, and actually, I don't think we visit as much anymore as we used to. And actually, whenever you do call out to see someone, they're always pleased. And I don't know whether we were more confident in those days to get out and about. And it's one of those things that I'm aware of, that people seem to have got out of the way of visiting each other and chatting and don't go out as much anymore. And I think people have become a little bit more insular and a bit more negative about spending time with people. And looking back, I think that was great to do that. But sometimes then, you meet up with people and you're not as used to having that kind of just chat. And then people get a bit more awkward with each other. So I think things have changed. Eamon's saying, you asked about the minicom, but I haven't thrown mine out. Mine is in my garage. I'm keeping it. Because I think that's a relic that I want to hold on to. I want to keep it. And every time I look at it, it brings back memories. So I like to keep those things. There are a few things that I have kept there. And obviously it's not used anymore. And even the fax isn't used these days. I know companies in the past always used to use faxes, and even they aren't using it because everybody uses email instead. And I suppose we're looking after the trees. We're not printing off so much paper, and that's all good, because I can remember the rolls and the cartridges we used to get, because it used to be all handwritten, didn't it, the faxes? And we used to pull out these rolls of paper and write loads. And the cartridges used to cost a fortune. I always remember giving off about that. But we don't use those as much anymore. Nowadays, we're texting each other. And I think looking back, that's a really big change. When you think about the way phones used to be, and the first phones, and then phones became smaller and smaller and smaller. And then, now we have what? People use their watch as their phone. Unbelievable. Technology will never stop developing and changing. I don't know where it's all going. Adam's saying, I think what we're going to have is, people where you never know, will be able to record hands, and we'll be hovering, and I don't know what's going to happen with signing, and how the signing itself is going to float through the air to someone else. Paul's saying, I wonder, does it have an impact though on English language skills? Because we used to spend so much time, using maybe our mini-coms or whatever, and nowadays I can use the video phone, FaceTime, WhatsApp or whatever, and I'm signing more. So I just wonder, am I using as much English? And whilst we have direct access to communication, there's pros and cons and everything. So that's not necessarily all good. Elizabeth, I think you were trying to get in there. Yeah, I agree with what you were saying there. In some ways, I miss that sort of English-based communication, and my husband and I do a lot of finger spelling, and we spend a lot of time with people who don't. But actually with some of our older friends, we fingerspell a lot more, and that's more English-based. And I miss that, and I miss that English-based communication, because we do have access to signing, but it's nice to have both types of communication involved. Eamon. And on the minicom, do you remember we had our codes? We had GA, and at the end you had SK. Do you remember the codes that you had in minicom? GA for go ahead, SK, stop king. And nowadays, you have texting, and whenever you say goodbye, I always think, oh, I miss my SK days. I remember the code that we had. It was lovely. Hidden code. Okay, one last question on this topic before we move on. We used to have minicoms and faxes. Nowadays, how do you contact your doctor or your bank or whoever or whatever you need to contact? How do you contact them? Elizabeth? Sometimes I have an interpreter go with me, but if I don't need an interpreter, then my husband and I can write a note. We go into the bank and we write notes down. And, you know, they're very good. They keep it private and they let us just write things down, pass notes back and forward. DHSS, sometimes I get an interpreter to go with me. There are certain places where I ask them to go. And then, you know, it's whatever makes it quicker. Sometimes you need that. Sometimes you have to write notes. It just depends, really. But interpreters are really useful. Eamon. I think sometimes the use of interpreters comes out when you need the full detail of what's being said. Sometimes you go to the bank and it's just a very simple thing that you're trying to achieve, and so you don't need an interpreter. But if it's a more in-depth conversation, then absolutely I would want an interpreter to ensure that I get all the detail across. So it really just depends. Paula. I think in the past we had to use type talk to contact the doctor, or we use type talk, and that's what we always had to use, text-based communication. But now we've got remote interpreting services, and since COVID, we have them for all the healthcare and education access, and it does make life a lot more straightforward because everybody else in society can pick up the phone whoever I want. So for us, I think this is transformational. Eamon saying, and the mobile phone is just a wee device that you can have in your pocket and have with you anytime, so you can access an interpreter. It's not like the old-fashioned phones, which were big, cumbersome things with a wire attached. Now with technology, it's portable. We can have it with us anywhere we go. We can go anywhere, take it with us, go to the bank, go to the doctor, and it does make access to life a whole lot more straightforward. I have a daughter in Thailand, and even when she's out there, or I have a sister in Australia, I can phone them on video phone, and it's absolutely wonderful. And I think for that kind of thing, it's brilliant. FaceTime is so fantastic. I could not live without that remote access to my family. I just love being able to chat to them. And nowadays, Adam's saying we have Portal, Facebook, we've got all sorts of WhatsApp, different ways of connecting in that we can use to keep in touch with family and friends. And those who move abroad, we can still stay in touch with remotely. And the world has become a very different place than it was, much easier. And nowadays with interpreters, because we can pop them onto a screen, that's so much easier as well, as opposed to what it used to be, where we had to think about what am I going to do and then wait to get hold of an interpreter. We don't need to do that anymore. We have instant access, and that's so important. Paula, and the thing is, we have our own dialect here in Northern Ireland. But I think what's happening is, you know, because we are accessing remote communication now on video phones, we're able to access people using sign language from all over the world, which I love. England, Scotland, Lithuania, and it becomes a melting pot of language, which is just fascinating. I'm loving seeing that happening. The world is becoming smaller, isn't it? Okay, Adam's saying, let's move on to our next topic, which is going to be to have a chat about relationships. And I was thinking how in the past, the deaf schools were the place probably where everybody went. And that's probably where people met someone who they would go into a relationship with and maybe go on to marry. So I'm just wondering what you would say about that, because that used to be the case when a lot of deaf children went to a single deaf school. Nowadays, that's not the same. So how do deaf people find relationships nowadays? Is it the same or has it changed? Elizabeth and Eamon, tell us how you met your partners. Was it in school? Eamon saying, I think it's very different now than it was in my time. There used to be a lot of little birds out there, you know, plenty of fish in the sea is maybe the metaphor I would use. And I think nowadays, it is harder, I think, for people to find someone. You know, they have to go on some of those platforms and try and find someone remotely. Or I mean, we had so many social events where everybody came in. There were lots of opportunities to meet other people. Harder to do that when you're meeting somebody on a screen, isn't it? And ask them out. You know that whole dance that you go through before you actually ask someone out? I mean, my wife was always chasing me when I was really, really young. I didn't realize that we'd end up, you know, married. So that's one of those things that oh, you met in school? Yeah, I mean, she was behind me in school for years. And, you know, my family and her family knew each other for years. I didn't realize we'd end up married, but we met through those ways, just one of those things. Yeah, I mean, I think we went out. I had been in at church, and then I went out to the room and I saw someone sitting in a corner. And then there was this other man with him. This other guy was Raymond, who knew my sister Rita, and this other guy, I didn't know who he was, and then it turned out he liked me, and then we were visiting another friend who was deaf, and then 2 years later, I bumped into him. Hadn't seen him in that whole time. That was a long time ago. And then we started to meet up just without anybody else knowing, to be honest. And then for 3 months, we didn't tell anybody. Only a couple of people knew, didn't tell anyone else. And then a couple of people started to pick up on the fact that we were meeting up. And then it just spread like wildfire. And we were together then, you know, we were in a relationship for 3 years, but our communication was by written letter in the post. And we met up once a month. I went over to his family's home, and then he come and stayed in my family home for a weekend. And that carried on for 3 years until we got married, and that's been it. Am I right, Elizabeth, in thinking that you two will be married 56 years this year? Yes, it will be. It'll be a 56th anniversary in October. Oh, well done, Elizabeth. Oh, thank you, everybody. 56 years. Paula, your stories are lovely of having met and got married. Now, that was nearly my story. I also went to school for the deaf, and it was someone else who I loved, and we had a very long relationship, a bit off and on. But then when we got to the age of 18, you know, we said, oh, you know, we'll get engaged, we'll get married. And everybody expected that we would. But when we got to my 18th birthday, I started realizing that there was a big wide world out there. There were people to see, places to go and travel. And I dumped this poor person because I moved on, because I realized that there was so much more out there. And, you know, I was then traveling a lot all around England and Europe. And so because we'd been so close for such a long time, I knew I needed to keep other relationships quiet, just to be fair on them. And then I was able to do that. Because I was in Northern Ireland, I didn't want that to impact on them. So, you know, I had to distance myself a bit. And now I'm with my current partner. We share a really strong interest in the arts, and with so much in common about that. And now we're together, and my partner is also deaf, which is lovely. Great stories. And can I ask, do you think the deaf community nowadays have to travel further to find relationships than they used to? Eamon's saying absolutely, because it used to be we all went to one large deaf school, but we're not doing that anymore. And I do see a real change in that. And I notice a lot more relationships with people. Their partners are coming in from other countries or from outside Northern Ireland, or their partners aren't even necessarily deaf anymore. And I can understand that, because society is so much more mixed. And people are traveling, and that's just life nowadays. Whereas in my time, it was very different. Do you know? Very, very different. I find that very, very interesting because I would be in the LGBTQ plus community, and I would know of some elderly deaf people in Northern Ireland who have told me that they were from that as well, but they have never told anybody in their entire life, and they're now quite elderly. And they're a bit shocked that young people can be so open about it. But I think for young deaf people in Northern Ireland, that can still be difficult in terms of finding a partner. And for them, they do have to travel a bit further to find a relationship. And so for people who are gay and lesbian, I mean, some of these older people tell me they've stayed single all their life because of that. Or other people go into a relationship with someone who isn't deaf, or they have to move outside Northern Ireland. And sometimes that's for other reasons. It could be for education, but I think things are so different from your time. They really are. And I'm saying, yes, so you're identifying there's a lot of changes now in terms of where people find their partner. People are traveling. They're not just meeting the people they went to school with. And also, people are in relationships now much more with people who aren't deaf. And that's maybe, do you think that's because society's more open and people out there are learning sign language more? Even saying, I mean, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that Northern Ireland is a very small deaf community. And for a long time, people did leave here to go over to England to study or to go to university, to college or university. And I think then they've met partners over there or they've got married over there. Some people have then come back here to live sometimes. But in my time, people didn't do that. They just stayed here. But I think that, you know, flexibility around travel is a very different feature of the community now than it used to be. Adam. And I think often there is that concern that we have in the community that we want to hold on to our people. We don't want them to leave us and we don't want them to be taken away. And if they do find a relationship outside Northern Ireland, we always hope that they'll come back here again. Paul is saying, I can remember, you know, when I was at school, about the age of 11, there were friends of mine who went over to school in England. And I lost a lot of friends at that time because a lot of them were sent over there. And when that happened, it changed life for us and for them. And I think that's, sorry, I forgot what the point I was going to make there, but that's just the thing. Even I think, Adam, there's a point there that's really important. I think, you know, it is so much more popular nowadays to learn sign language, and I think that creates opportunities for deaf people to meet other people. Although I think it, you know, it isn't easy when you're deaf to go out and think, you know, I could have a girlfriend who isn't deaf. I think that's an interesting one. So maybe I was talking about the number of fish in the sea. Maybe there's more fish available now than there used to be. Elizabeth saying, yeah, I mean, I think I see that happening much more commonly nowadays. I've seen, you know, relationships where both of them were deaf and they haven't worked out well. And I've seen relationships where one of them were deaf and it hasn't worked out well. I honestly think, though, it is easier, you know, when they're both deaf. Personally, that's my view. Adam saying, yes, I think what you're stressing is the communication is what's important. Okay, yeah. So let's move on to our final topic, which is sports. And I can see that Eamon's just perking up there. Can't wait to jump in. So in terms of sports, when we think back, deaf people used to be involved in lots of different sporting activities. Football was something that deaf people competed in regularly. They were in lots of tournaments. That's one sport. What do you think about that and why it's declined a bit? Eamon? Well, back in my time, if I'm honest, I think I was just very lucky. I went to Jordanstown School and we had our own football team. It was a deaf football team. And we played against the other teams. And we all had that shared thing about being together. And even when we left school, that shared sense of being a team carried on. And a lot of us went on to play, you know, for Ulster, and we played against Connacht and Munster and all those other ones. And I played from the age of 16 until I was 34 against all the other counties. And it was just fantastic to be in that. and then the Belfast Deaf Club, I remember we played in the league, and those were great days. And, I was playing against sometimes people who I went to school with, and then sometimes with people who went over to study in England, and they would come home for the holidays at Christmas, Easter, and they'd play. And it was brilliant for years. It was so much fun, but it has faded a lot. And nowadays, it's not even, the teams aren't even all deaf. They've had to bring in, young people who aren't deaf to try and bulk up the numbers. They've really struggled, and they've pulled out of the league. Now, again, we did have a bit of a resurgence, and they joined in the league again, but it went for a while and then they struggled again. And that's the thing, it's not just here in Belfast. It's the same across the water. We know that's been happening with some of the deaf football clubs in England. They can't get the numbers because you don't have the numbers attending the deaf schools anymore, and then they don't trickle through. I mean, I can remember that, there used to be 4 teams, A, B, C, and D. And nowadays, we don't even have one. So it's disappointing, actually, to reflect on that. Paul and Elizabeth, did you have any sporting involvements when you were growing up? Elizabeth said, yes, hockey. When I was 6 to school, I was in school, and we had a headmaster there who was very old-fashioned and kept us indoors. So when that headmaster left and they brought a new one in, he had a much better approach, and he arranged lots of activities. So we had swimming every Saturday, and actually he did join with us when we went swimming. We were taken out for walks, played golf, and we had one teacher who taught tennis. And we went on the Lisburn Road, we went out and we played tennis, and I loved that. Swimming, tennis, walking, and some other games as well. I mean, it was just fantastic, absolutely brilliant. But before that, we'd nothing. And then, but the thing is, I'm not a particularly sporty person. I enjoy my sewing and my knitting, so I stopped them then when I left school. Did you compete, Elizabeth, against teams from around Ireland? No. We just played within school. And when I left school, then I stopped. I went back home when I left school to the farm to be with my family, and I stayed there on the farm for 4 years, and I was happy enough there. I didn't feel lonely on the farm with my family. I just stayed there with them, helped out, went and visited a friend, went for walks, did things. I had a great time. I never felt lonely in those days, but I didn't play sports. I was quite happy on my own for those 4 years. Then I moved back to Belfast and just carried on with life. But I've never been a sporty person. I love watching tennis though. And I don't like anybody getting in my way when I'm watching tennis. I enjoy it. Okay, Paula, were you ever involved in competitive sports? I mean, you've talked about a whole range of sporting activities at school. When I was at school, we didn't have much going on in terms of sport. It wasn't great. There was a football team, but there wasn't much else. We seemed to chat all the time or be in relationships, and that was the main focus. But when I left school, I remember going to FP, the club there, and they had badminton. And that was brilliant because it was sporty and people chatted. It was both came together. And then at Easter, they had the provincials every year, if you remember. People from all around Ireland used to come, as Eamon saying, we had the Ulster, all the different teams came together, and that was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I didn't participate. I tried to play once, but I realized it was pretty crap. So I'm an artist, I'm not a sporty person. But for me, the actual experience of being there and meeting so many people, BSL, ISL, it was just fantastic, just meeting people. And again, that was an opportunity to meet friends, develop relationships, and maybe find a partner. But I can remember those days, and they were Easter every year. And I think the fact that we're not getting them at the minute is really a big loss for us in Northern Ireland. And I always feel like the momentum for sports in Northern Ireland has really died away, and it bothers me a bit for the future. We have had a question come in from those watching on Facebook, and it's from Ruth Kelly. And she's asking why you think that's happening. Why do we have less people in the deaf community involved in sports together? Is it back to the education system, or what is it? Eamon saying, yeah, I would agree with Ruth there. We do have less people involved in sport. I mean, I think school was the place where I had so many opportunities because there were so many deaf children. There are far fewer deaf children coming together in school nowadays. And I think the opportunities for them are much less. And so obviously, if football scouts are going out, they are going around the mainstream schools, and there's probably less opportunities for deaf children to get selected. Whereas when we were in a deaf school, we got on the team because we were all part of the school. I don't know how deaf children and young people access those opportunities nowadays. And also, I was in an environment where we all chatted and we had information, and the older ones used to tell the younger ones things. Nowadays, I don't know how our young deaf children are learning about sports. I don't know where those opportunities are available to them. Okay, Paula? Paula said, I think language is a big part of this. I mean, when we were at school, we used sign language, and that was what we did. And everybody signed around the sporting events. All the spectators all signed to each other. Any sporting events I've attended nowadays, half the people there don't really, they're quite oral. They use a lot of trying to sign, a bit of gesturing, but it means that those of us who are attending to observe and spectate actually find it a little bit more difficult to interact with each other and socialize, because I'm having to try and lip read them, and they're trying to understand my signing. And I think that's had a big impact on the community feel that there used to be around sporting events. Eamon's saying, yeah, that would be true. I mean, in the past, you know, we used to go to FP, we used to go to St. Joseph's, we used to go to KC, and people played bowls, and we had four-a-sides and tournaments, and we had all sorts of tournaments around the bowling clubs in all of those. And we actually traveled all across Ulster playing bowls. And the bowling fours actually are starting to die away. We just don't have as much going on. The deaf clubs are closing down, St. Joseph's closing down, Wilton House closed down. And because of that, there's less opportunities. And our badminton was so successful for so many years. Our badminton team competed, but that's just died away too because they couldn't attract young deaf people in to play badminton. I mean, at one time we had over 60 people playing, involved actively in tournaments. I mean, our top player got to the point where, you know, they were in their 60s, our top players, and they had to stop. We used to have billiards, we used to have darts, we used to play pool when we had Wilton House. When that building was our centre, we had lots of sporting activities. Since it closed, I think a lot of that isn't available anymore. KC still run a bowling club, and they still are involved in the tournaments. If it wasn't for KC Bowling Club, it would have stopped completely. It would have been wiped off the face of this, you know, Northern Ireland's bowling scene. But it is crucial. Where there is sports, there is a community event. If we don't have sports, we don't have that community participation. And that is where we have the knock-on impact from the sports itself. When we were competitive, we used to come across teams who, you know, weren't deaf, and it really made an impact on them. And they used to tell us how, you know, how competitive we were and how good we were. And we never got to be the top, but we were always in the top 3 teams. And they used to say they were always amazed by how good we were and how, you know, how excellent we played our bowls. And it's really difficult to see all that coming to an end. Paul is saying, I'm noticing now that there's a lot of young people seem to be playing basketball actually in the deaf community. That seems to be growing. And the football, perhaps what's happening is deaf people are going into their local club, even if it's not got other deaf people in it, they're going out. So I think there is a little bit of a drift towards that, but it would be good to see that. Emma's just saying, yeah, I agree with you, Paula, there. I think that's important. It used to be that we had our own deaf team for football. Now what's happening is deaf players are going into the mainstream clubs. And that's good, but there's typically only 1, 2, maybe 3 in that club. And I don't know that they necessarily get the full benefit of being there. And I honestly don't even know if they're that regular in attending. When we had ours, then we had a very strict training regime and everybody came. I'm not sure it's the same for them nowadays. So Adam's saying, what you're saying is that deaf young people nowadays are perhaps going into mainstream activities. So if they want to do yoga, they'll go and do that in their local yoga club or whatever it is. Horse riding, they'll go maybe do archery in their local club because they just want to do that. So perhaps what we have is a broader range of opportunities, but it's not deaf people coming together as a community. And Paula, you were talking about that sense of community that is developed, and that you're saying communication perhaps isn't as easy nowadays because they used to all use sign language, and now young people are coming in, and it's actually, it used to be everybody signed and the odd young deaf person would come and they would learn very quickly. But nowadays, the majority of people perhaps aren't signing, and the signer comes in, and there's not as many opportunities for those who don't sign to learn sign language around those sporting events. Eamon saying, I can remember my time, Belfast Deaf Club, individuals like that coming in, Adam, they came straight from school and they couldn't sign. And we always made them really welcome. And we didn't teach them. They just came in and they learned to sign because they were around us. You know, the thing is, we were with our work colleagues all day. We came out to be ourselves and we didn't teach them. They were able to just join in and they watched the language and they kept coming and they kept coming until they got to the point where they could sign for themselves because they were deaf too. And that's what used to happen. Paula, Adam's mentioned some of the other things that people are joining in, such as yoga. One of the things that I've noticed is since the advent of COVID-19, deaf people are starting to get involved in online sporting activities such as yoga or fitness classes. And actually, these opportunities to go online mean that there's information about sports and nutrition and all sorts of things happening online. So that's an interesting development in the world of sports. Elizabeth, my husband and I would go to the Bangor Deaf Lunch Club. It's for elderly deaf people. And we really enjoy being out there. Everyone is deaf, and there's about 34 people, all attend regularly. And, you know, they're all in the elderly bracket, but there's a very broad age range within that. And it was always twice a month. With the advent of COVID, that's not happening. And that's really hard. And trying to keep in touch with each other, you know, is challenging. And it was great. It was our social outlet. It was a great place to be. And it's really hard to be without that. And, you know, it's a year now that we haven't been able to meet up, and who knows when we will be able to again. Oh, Paula saying, I hope it's soon. Adam saying, another question has come in. Another one from Ruth Kelly here. Let me just have a look at what she's saying. Okay. So Ruth's saying is that the deaf community used to meet around sporting events, but nowadays deaf people are going out to mainstream sporting events. And maybe that's a more private thing for them than it used to be. Maybe they have more privacy that way. Maybe, you know, people want to be more private nowadays. What would you think about that? Eamon's saying, you know, it's entirely possible. I mean, one of the things that I was observed is we don't have a big deaf sporting scene anymore, and people are out there. And it used to be that we used to get together, as Paula said, it was community, we all signed together, and that's not happening anymore. And I've ended up joining a bowling club, a lawn bowling club, a mainstream one myself. I've done that. There's about 4 or 5 friends of mine, we're all deaf, and we've all joined a small group within that. And I think that is happening. People are joining, and it's up to individuals. But from my own perspective, I'm far happier having this group with me. There's about 4 or 5 of us together, and it makes it much more relaxing because, you know, if you go to those bowls events, everybody sits around the edges and chats, and having those friends there means we can chat too in sign language, and I've done that all my life. And if I was on my own, I feel like I'd struggle. And to be quite honest, all I would do would be throw a few balls and then go home. I wouldn't hang around. Whereas because I have a small group with me, then we all just chat after, and it's great. Elizabeth, did you have something you wanted to say there? No? Paula? Back to that point again. I think what I notice is that deaf people have less of a deaf identity these days. So I have a group of friends, right? And we were chatting. Then sometimes, we see other deaf people who aren't sign language users, but, they're more oral, and you can see the reaction to them. And people actually almost don't want to sign in public. You can see this reaction of this kind of, the hands go down, the expression reduces, and I don't know, I think deaf identity is not something that people have as much as they used to. And I would almost say it's a hearing identity. Things have changed. It used to be we'd be anywhere, and if I saw my friends, I'd go flying up to them, smack them on the shoulder, and sign away in public. But I'm seeing nowadays people, when they see other people signing, kind of get a wee bit awkward about it and walk away, and the signing space is reduced and the expression's reduced and they're a bit more withdrawn. I don't know if that's a confidence issue, an embarrassment issue, or whether a sense of deaf identity is something that's starting to fade a little bit. Be interesting to research that, wouldn't it? Adam said, and that could be back to the education system, whereby people don't have the opportunity to go to these large deaf schools where everybody was the same. And so they are more private and they're used to being in smaller groups. Eamon, you had something to say there? Yes, so something that comes to mind is that in my time, we used to have the invitation games where we would invite people from all over the UK or Ireland or Europe, and we travelled loads. I mean, we paid our expenses out of pocket and we loved it. Those things aren't happening anymore. You have the European clubs, you have the English clubs, but they themselves seem to be struggling in terms of numbers, and the invitation games just don't seem to be happening anymore. And so it's a worldwide thing, I think. Just keeping an eye on the time, and it's nearly time to finish. So I just wanted to ask one more question before we finish. Now, what I'm wondering about is we've covered 3 topics tonight. We've talked about sport, relationships, and technology. And I'd like to throw in a 4th, and that will be coronavirus. We are living in a time of COVID where we are all at home. How do you think the deaf community is reacting to that? Is it harder? Is it better? What's your response? Oh, that's an interesting one. Elizabeth. My husband got a letter from a doctor to say that, just from Dr. McBride, to say that he had a shield and can't go out. So we can't go out and visit people, can't go out to the shops, can't go out to the banks or anything. And he has to stay at home, can only go around the garden. And it's so boring and so frustrating. Now, I'm happy enough being at home, but it is hard. And sometimes, we go out and he drives me there, sits in the car, and I walk over to the shops and the bank, and he has to stay in the car. And I have bits and pieces I can get on with in the house and things like that. But, I'm okay. And thank God I'm okay. It hasn't been too bad, but I know of people who are really struggling and very isolated. I think personally I'm all right. I'm used to it. I find stuff to get on with, to be honest. Eamon? Okay. To me, the massive loss has been meeting my deaf friends in sporting events. And it's really had a massive impact on me that I'm stuck at home. And I can't wait to get back to the point where I can do that, because sports was the community place. And the thing is, I'm worried that because of COVID, then we're going to lose momentum we even had already. It's going to be even harder. With COVID, we can't have tournaments, we can't have competitions. And the thing is, we're still in touch with each other, and we're all, wondering when we can get back. But things just seem to be dragging on and on. I hope we can get back again. Paula. Yeah, I miss just meeting people for a cuppa, for a coffee, and having some quality time together. But I've noticed that deaf people who are signers are lonely. I have people phoning me for a chat, and I'm busy, I'm busy, I've got a lot on. And I notice a lot of people out there, people my age, pretty young, really lonely, just desperate for a chat and don't seem to have much information. And I'm looking at some of the older generation, like Elizabeth has just said, she finds stuff to get on with. Whereas the younger ones that I'm in touch with seem to be more lonely. Elizabeth just said I would agree with that. And so I think there's a bit of a different response going on here. Elizabeth? I mean, I have to say, remote communications such as FaceTime are such a blessing. I don't know what I'd do without all that. We have the ability to chat to other people across, you know, that now. I'm so grateful for that. You know, and chatting to other people, and it's such a blessing, and I'm so grateful for FaceTime. It is fantastic. I could not live without it. Oh yeah, I'm sure we all agree. Paul is saying, and I think it's interesting you've mentioned that. We've got FaceTime, we've got all these things, but I think young people that I'm talking to are just so isolated, so lonely. And I'm seeing a lot of that, you know, and I think it's difficult. I'd be worried about the mental health impact that all this is going to have. And I was just saying, well, that's great. We've come to an end. And I think that's us for tonight. In terms of COVID and the impact of COVID and the fact that we're all stuck at home and can't get out, whilst it's tough, I think we can be grateful that we're not in 2020 anymore. We're in 2021. We've got technology. We've got access to remote interpreters, access to remote communications to chat to each other. 10 or 20 years ago, those things wouldn't have been possible. Nowadays, with technology, we have been able to connect with each other. And even this event tonight, which is running off Zoom and streaming out live, demonstrates that. We have another comment in here from Richard Doherty. And he is saying it's been a really interesting time watching all the stories tonight. Saying, and I think what we need to do is ensure that deaf people who do go through mainstream education, who have a very different life, are encouraged to be involved. I think we need to find ways and creative ways of bringing them in and interacting across the piece. So when we have sporting events, that we're making them open and inclusive to them and thinking about how we can bring them in. Even saying that's completely true, absolutely. Adam saying, so can I thank you all? Can I thank Elizabeth, Eamon and Paula for your time this evening and for what you've had to share. And I'm sure everybody watching along will like to join with me in saying that to you. Can I thank Vanessa, who's been interpreting for us into ISL tonight. And we have a BSL interpreter who's actually putting all into English. So let's say thank you to her as well. And finally, thank you to the Department for Communities who have funded this and made it all possible this evening. The DVD is going on the website and you can see it there. And those of you who are watching, join us again next week. And we'll let you know tomorrow what the 3 topics will be for the next session. Keep a look out on the BDA Northern Ireland Facebook page, and the 3 topics will be put on there tomorrow for next week. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for joining in. Bye everyone.